Hi there, my name is Barry Naroff, and this is going to be a weekly segment. It's a new series that I'm starting where I'll be talking about different cases that I've done, basically to illustrate the type of work that comes through me. Of course, the names and specific details are going to be changed because there's ethical concerns, but you'll get the general gist of what the different varieties of sessions are that I've dealt with. Now, first, I'm going to give you a little bit biography. Then I'll go into what a psychotherapist is, and then I'll talk about some of my spiritual, psychic, and intuitive development. So basically, I grew up in New York City, went to university there, and then for grad school, first I went to, excuse me, University of Louisville in Louisville, Kentucky, and then Washington University in St. Louis. Initially for a PhD program in clinical psychology. Turned out to not be a good match. It was the scientific practitioner model, and it focused on Freudian psychology and behavioral psychology, neither of which are my preferable treatment modalities. And then I went 2 years later to Washington University, which was nirvana for me. It was pure 2 years of clinical training by the best of the best. I'll go into that in a minute. So what happened is at Washington University, I ended up getting a MSW degree, Master of Social Work. And my official degree is I'm a New York State licensed clinical social worker, but I call myself psychotherapist. When I was in the program at the University of Louisville, this is around the second week in November, I was doing some IQ testing with the only other person in my class who couldn't drive. Being a New Yorker, of course, I couldn't drive. And as we were walking back from doing the testing, she said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a witch. Would you like to come to my house for Thanksgiving?" And my response was classic. I said, "You can't be a witch. You're in a PhD program in experimental psychology." Well, we both laughed. And she said, No, I really am a witch. And would you like to come to my house for Thanksgiving, and you could meet my husband, and you could meet my husband's wife? That was the start of a fascinating lifelong adventure. So I went to their house, met her husband, met her husband's other wife, and she asked me after this delicious dinner if I'd like to lie down on my stomach and get a massage. Never had one before, so I figured, yes, definitely, I'd love it, even though I was pretty full. So I lay down, and she ran her hands in the air over my back for about an hour, which ended up leaving me pretty annoyed and frustrated because I was looking forward to a real body massage. So she asked me how it was, and I said, well, I felt nothing. But she explained that what she was doing in aura combing and basically realigning and straightening out the energies in my body. Okay, yeah, that's what you say. But they were interesting people. They live within walking distance. I didn't have a car. And I became friends with all three of them. The husband, named Kenneth, was running a series of psychic development classes, about 4 a week. And fortunately, being a poor student and becoming a friend, he let me attend for free. So I went to all these fascinating classes. I'd walk over, they'd drive me over, I met tons of really interesting people, learned a lot of stuff, and it was an incredible awakening. They also used to hold a lot of spiritual parties with the most fascinating guests, some of whom had astounding abilities, some of whom just had really interesting stories. So it was like one eye-opening experience after another. And being surrounded by them so much, it sort of rubbed off. After the first year, I left the clinical program, but I stayed in Louisville for another year. And they hired me doing IQ testing, which basically financed my stay. I didn't need much money. I was living on like $400 a month. Things were cheap. And then in about February of 1997, I think, they introduced me to a woman who they said she was German, and she introduced herself. I don't remember her name. She was in her 60s, and back then I was like 22, 23. And she said, yes, my name is whatever, and I'm from Germany, and I'm a Nazi. Okay. Nazi meets Jew. And she explained that during the war, she was a teacher. All teachers by law had to be members of the Nazi Party or else they'd be fired. And she was the sole support of her extended family because she was in a small village. And she said she shut her eyes and shut her ears. I don't know who remembers Schultz from F Troop, but know nothing, see nothing. Well, that's what she did. And I asked her, didn't you notice the Jewish shops being shuttered? She said, I didn't pay attention. I couldn't afford to. But after the war, when she opened her eyes and opened her ears and really allowed herself to become aware of what the Nazi parties were doing and what they stood for, she was horrified, fled from Germany in 1948, moved to the States, and decided to spend the rest of her life personally doing reparations to the Jewish community. So when she found out that I was Jewish, she wanted to work with me and help me develop my psychic abilities. So she worked with the Ouija board, which is definitely not something I would recommend, but I was protected. Many people are not, and it's one of the two instruments that are given over to the dark forces. But being protected, I was okay. And initially, you move this planchette around the board, and I was able to eventually figure out the letter it was going to before it got there, then the word, then sometimes the sentence, and by sometime in early May, I was able to get the whole paragraph. And then she turned to me and she said, you don't need me anymore. You're channeling. So that was how I developed the ability to channel. I also met my first person who had a near-death experience. He explained what it was like going through the light, being greeted on the other side, then coming back. I've encountered many, many more since then. So after that, I moved to St. Louis, and it was a very, very different time in the late 70s, where the New Age was just coming into flower, and everything was free. So I was a member of one organization called the Finhorn Garden, and then we changed the name to a Lorien Association. And the Finhorn Garden is a garden that's located in northern Scotland, and it was founded in conjunction with the nature spirits, the Devic realm. So they would grow subtropical plants in a sometimes near Arctic climate. So they had monthly people who would go and present. Then there was also an organization called the Spiritual Frontier Fellowship, where they brought in top psychics and professionals from all over the country, sometimes all over the world, who came and lectured and demonstrated and taught. And the university also had weekly, monthly psychic development classes in the student center, in the cafeteria. And a few thousand people would attend from the community. And they also had classes and workshops. That's where I took a weekend class in Huna by the guy who first brought it to the United States in the 1950s. Incredible stuff, all free. And one day at this large psychic class in the student center, there's a woman at the table, and we were talking, and it turns out she was the wife of one of my professors. So she said, "Look, my husband's having a party this weekend. Would you like to come?" I said, "Sure, of course." So I came, and it was a very nice gathering. And then in the middle, I started getting a pressure on the top of my head. And didn't really know what it is, but I thought that this was a signal that somebody wanted to talk through me. So I said to her, "I think I'm getting a message for you. Would you like to hear it?" She got all excited and said, "Yes, of course, I'd love it." So we went under the proverbial staircase in the hallway where it was quiet. And that was my first public channeling. And since then, well, I've been channeling since 1977, and it's 2020. So, long time. Now, let me tell you the difference. There's a psychiatrist, psychologist, either clinical or counseling, and clinical social workers. Psychiatrists, of course, are MDs. They go to medical school. They specialize in psychiatry. Traditionally, psychiatrists used to be trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy, generally Freudian, though not all psychiatrists are Freudian. Some are Jungian or others, but they used to be trained in the expertise of the psychological schools out there. That has pretty much gone out of fashion because the insurance reimbursement for psychiatrists is not so great compared to the costs in their training. So most psychiatrists now basically just do medication. They talk a little, but it's hard to find a psychiatrist who does psychotherapy, and even harder to find a psychiatrist who is not Freudian. They do exist, but rare nowadays. The second one is either a clinical or a counseling psychology. They are psychologists, and like psychiatrists, a licensed profession. The title is licensed and regulated, and they tend to obtain the best training. They study 4 years of clinical training, how to be a psychologist, how to do therapy. In all forms of psychotherapy, they're trained in diagnostic, as are psychiatrists. And as a class, they tend to be the best trained therapists out there. I'm a clinical social worker. As a class, very, very, very few social work schools really offer good clinical training. And many of the ones that do are Freudian, which in my opinion is fantastic if you want to do diagnostics and help someone become aware of their neuroses and their patterns, but not too good at helping them change. And it's long and slow and expensive. So I'm not a big fan. But the program that I went to had a philosophy of hiring the best and brightest in every field as part-time adjunct faculty. So I was absolutely blessed. I studied with the top people in family therapy, Peggy Papp, Virginia Satir, and Carl Mnuchin, all in person. I believe they've all passed since many years now. I studied with the Ericksonian Institute, which is out of New York, in clinical hypnotherapy. It's the top institute in the country. I studied group therapy out of Topeka, Kansas. I forget the name of the head of the program, but I studied with him. Again, one of the top programs in group psychodynamics. And I also studied transactional analysis, which I loved. It was one of those flash in the pan type of therapies. Very, very popular for about 4 years, and then it totally vanished. But it was great, and I still use a lot of it in my therapy. The book was written by Eric Byrne, and I'm Okay, You're Okay. You may find some yellowed copies from the 70s in the used book section. I don't know why it died. It had a lot of validity, but it did. And then I studied Gestalt therapy, which is my primary clinical modality, with someone who trained directly with Fritz Perls, who is the originator of it. He was in Esalen, and they studied in the hot tub. Very early 70s, very hippie era. But it's a great, very present-oriented here and now. And those are basically the psychological trainings that I've had. Plus, of course, I was exposed to many, many others over the years. And when I started working with clients, I combined my channeling with the psychological training that I had. And I call myself a psychotherapist because nobody really knows what a clinical social worker is. But psychotherapist is easily recognized. It's not a legally protected title. So actually anybody can call themselves a psychotherapist, and a lot of people do. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker who calls himself a psychotherapist because that's what I do. I do psychotherapy. And when I started doing it, initially I was just straight what I learned in school. And when I moved back to New York, which is where I practice out of, I started combining channeling with psychotherapy. And I started my practice in New York in 1986. So I've been doing it for a long time. And what happens is I do two things. People come for a reading. Not everybody, but I strongly recommend it. In a reading, I like a total tabula rasa. I like to know nothing about the person. And they just sit down, they tell me their name, if they're married, the name of their spouse, if they have kids, the names of the children. And if they have questions about their job, I'd like to know what they do. I used to not and try to guess it, but what's the point? And if they have questions about others, their relationship to them, and if the children, their ages. Those are the only things I ask. And then I connect with their personal guides, and information comes pouring out. And I do the guides because people like specificity. And there's been some really incredible specifics that have come out of my mouth. Some things that surprised me, some things that shocked me. But in the future, I'll be having clinical case studies where I'll be talking about changing, of course, the names and a lot of specific details, but giving you a general gist of what happens. The type of work that occurs when this information comes through me. I found that even though I have really great clinical training, a lot of the information that comes through when I'm channeling, I could not possibly have known. I could not possibly have gotten myself. And it's much higher than the guides, and they have a bigger and broader perspective. So it's always a thrill. I never really know what's going to come out of my mouth. And sometimes, as I said, things really astound me. So that's a little bit about who I am, where I got my training, how I got my psychic and intuitive development, and the type of career path I do and what I do. So each week I'll be posting another case study. If you'd like to contact me, ask me more questions about what I do, or if you'd like to set up an appointment, I recommend a reading first. Not everybody gets it. A reading is about an hour, hour and 15 minutes. I ask that you allocate about 2 hours because there's always some discussion beforehand and afterwards. And psychotherapy, I don't give 45 minutes. It's an hour. I've tried 45 minutes. It just doesn't work for me. So I give a full hour, give or take a few minutes. So if you'd like to find out more about me, I have a webpage called Birthright Therapy. That's BIRTHRIGHT all one word, .com. Or you can write me at barry@birthrighttherapy.com. So, look to my YouTube channel. These series will be posted about once a week. And I look forward to hearing from some of you. Until then.